Hello everyone. For this week's video, we will learn about the opposite of transparency, aka opacity. We will also learn more in depth how gradients work, and a more detailed explanation of why I chose PNG over JPEG or other file formats during the first lesson. We will also be using a free alternative to Photoshop named GIMP instead of Microsoft Paint from this point forward. In addition to being completely free, GIMP uses a little less than 1/10 of Photoshop's memory when it comes to the RAM usage on your computer. GIMP is also natively supported on Linux, whereas on Photoshop you would have to emulate it. Even with all that being said, however, GIMP has less overall tools than Photoshop, although also like Photoshop, GIMP is continuously updated by its developers. Also like Photoshop, GIMP allows you to import tools made by people outside the program. Although for this tutorial series, we will be more concerned with using the default tools provided by the program. As mentioned during the previous week, Microsoft Paint lacks many features that more versatile tools such as Photoshop and GIMP do have. One of the biggest of these is the opacity feature, which acts similar to a color parameter. The catch is that opacity works on a basis of layers rather than applying to the whole image at once. Note that the more layers you have while editing, the more RAM the image will take while you edit it. Both Photoshop and GIMP allow you to create a new layer, lock the current layer, which prevents it from being edited, hide the current layer, which means it's still there, but it's just fully transparent so it doesn't look like it's there, delete the current layer, which removes it entirely, and even select multiple layers at once and group them, similar to how you use folders to group files on a regular computer app. Adding and deleting layers are provided by a simple button on the Layers menu at the bottom of the respective menu, and adding groups is also provided by a button on that same area. On Photoshop, you click to the left of an individual layer to lock it, which prevents anything and everything on that layer from being edited. But on GIMP, the process is slightly different. If you look at the top of the layer menu to the right of the screen, you will see 3 different lock options, represented with a paintbrush, a 4-direction arrow, and a small grid, respectively. The paintbrush represents that you lock all the pixels from being edited, but you can still move the image and edit the transparency data. Similarly, the arrow prevents you from moving the layer, but you can still edit the transparency in pixels. Lastly, the grid prevents you from editing the transparency data, but allows you to move the image and edit the pixels. The hide feature, however, works the same way in both Photoshop and GIMP, and is represented by an eyeball to the left of the image. As you might expect, the eyeball showing means the layer is visible, whereas the eyeball not showing when you click it means that it is hidden. If you click it again, it will come back. Note that there is also an option to link layers, but we will ignore that for now, because we will be using that in a later tutorial discussing how to blend layers. One final thing to note is that, although there is no explicit button for deleting layer groups, you can simply click on the group and click Delete Layer, which will delete the group and ungroup all the layers within it for you. Now that we have gone over the basic layer tools, we can freely discuss what opacity does. You may notice at the top of the layer menu is a bar with the word opacity in it and a number to the right of that. This bar will allow you to either click and drag to change the number, or click on the number itself to type in a precise value. The number represents a percentage value for the transparency of the layer, with 0 being fully transparent, and 100 being no transparency whatsoever. This works in the opposite way because, as mentioned in the beginning of the video, opacity, the name of the slider, is the opposite of transparency. Note that just like RGB values from the previous lesson, an opacity value between 0 and 100 will emphasize whichever extreme point it is closer to. So an opacity of 95 will only be slightly transparent, while an opacity of 5 will be so transparent you can barely see anything. With opacity out of the way, we are now able to discuss how gradients work. You may have noticed in Photoshop that when you click on the gradient tool and then click on the image to apply the gradient, a pop-up window will appear, and there will be a button inside the pop-up window named Gradient Editor. That will only appear when you click on the gradient image in the middle of the pop-up. After you select one color each for the two colors at the bottom of the tool menu on the left side of the screen, you should select the New Gradient option, and it will use the two colors you selected as the beginning and ending colors of the gradient respectively. However, if you are using GIMP instead like me, the process is slightly different. Unlike Photoshop, you will not be prompted for a gradient when you apply the gradient tool to the image, and so you either have to click the gradient tab on the right or hit Ctrl+G to bring up the gradients list. You may now either click one of the gradients and then edit gradient beneath the list, right-click one of the gradients, providing a drop-down menu with Edit Gradient as the first option you see. Just like accessing the editor is different between Photoshop and GIMP, so too is how the actual editor works. While Photoshop allows you to move one slider on the far left end and one slider on the far right end, GIMP instead treats these endpoints as fixed and immovable. Photoshop also has multiple midpoints by default to let you make a smooth transition, whereas GIMP only has one movable midpoint by default. Photoshop also has multiple gradient styles, whereas GIMP only has one, linear. The style options in Photoshop are provided by either using the Style drop-down menu in the Gradient Editor window, or by clicking one of the Style buttons on the top when you are using the Gradient tool. The last major gradient feature that Photoshop has that GIMP does not is a smoothness percentage, which, as you can imagine, moves the midpoints for you instead of making you drag the midpoints yourself. You can also add multiple midpoint sliders in both Photoshop and GIMP to create more complicated gradients than a simple two-color transition. However, most game graphics use single midpoint two-color gradients, and more complicated images use more complicated features than simply adding more sliders to a gradient. The gradient styles in Photoshop besides linear are radial, which radiates the first color out into the second color, i.e. the first color is the inner circle, while the second color is the outer circle. Angular, which works by making the gradient in a clockwise transition rather than a straight left to right. Reflected, which makes the first color in the center rather than the left, and the second color on both the left and right for a mirror reflection look. And finally diamond, which works like radial, except that you have an inner diamond and outer diamond shape rather than circle. Although GIMP does not have styles like Photoshop or a smoothness percentage like Photoshop, it does allow you to quickly change the first and second colors right in the editor. By right-clicking on the gradient. Right-clicking on the gradient also allows you to determine whether each color is a foreground or background color, determine if a color is transparent or not, change the blending function for a segment, which works like the smoothness percentage in Photoshop, except you have mathematical functions to select from instead of a percentage slider. Flip segments of the gradient backwards so that the colors are reversed. Split the gradient into segments either at the midpoint or in equal amounts. Delete segments of a gradient, or smoothly blend the colors and opacity of a gradient segment. Ultimately, there is no clear right versus wrong whether Photoshop or GIMP is superior. It just depends on what gradient tool you feel most comfortable with. One final note about making gradients is that you don't necessarily have to memorize all these things about creating them, as there exists hundreds of pre-made gradients online, stored in the file extension GRD. Once you simply download these images off the web and then put them in your Photoshop or GIMP gradient folders, you should be able to easily use these pre-made gradients. However, I still believe it is important to know how to make your own gradients in case you are not satisfied with the pre-made gradients you found. The last thing I'd like to discuss in this tutorial is why I was so specific about using PNG formats instead of any other file format. The answer is that if you used the other common format, JPEG, you would not be able to see the transparency, as that file format discards all the transparency information. PNGs take up more space on your RAM and hard drive, not only because they aren't as compressed as JPEGs, but also because they use an extra component of the image for transparency, which, although the slider for opacity may say 0 to 100, in reality is still stored as 0 to 255 as well, just like RGB values. The reason why everything in an image is stored as 255 max is because each component of the image, known formally as a channel, takes up 1 byte or 8 bits. This means that doing the math, 1 bit would take one of two values, while 1 byte or 8 bits would take 2 to the power of 8 equals 256 possible values. However, 0 counts as a value as well, which is why 255 rather than 256 is the maximum for each channel. It stands to reason that with the transparency component, formerly known as the alpha channel, that PNGs would take up 1 byte greater than JPEGs per pixel, ignoring things such as compression, because the alpha channel affects every pixel the way that the R, G, and B channels do as well. This 1 byte per pixel increase is not a problem for most RAM and hard drives, even cheap ones, as usually the cheapest RAMs and hard drives are in the gigabyte range nowadays. However, this still is something to be mindful about if you wish to render a large image, such as a game's main menu, or if you wish to share images online, because very large PNGs can be slow to upload or download. It is also possible to save PNGs as 24-bit, aka without transparency, so that they require less memory to store and render. However, this is often not used in practice, as JPEGs have a compression algorithm that make file sizes a lot smaller while still being 24-bit colors. In next week's tutorial, we will discuss PNG versus JPEG compression. This is very important to know, because besides issues of file size, some of the tools in GIMP and Photoshop are sensitive to the changes in color that are more pronounced in JPEG compression compared to PNG compression. Don't forget to subscribe if you found this video informative, and make sure to visit the other tutorial videos and follow me on either Facebook or Twitter for more content.